Hi class, welcome to session 1 of Psych 101. I'm Miss Patterson and I'm excited to start this new class with you guys. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background and some extra resources related to session 1's information. Since we're an online class, I know it's a little bit hard to get that same in-class feel as you would if you were in seat. So this is my attempt to bridge that gap. First of all, just a little overview of this week's assignments. There are 4 things expected of you guys this week. First is your reading, and that's every week. I really encourage you guys to stay on top of that because since we won't have in-class time, that's really the main way you'll be getting kind of the meat of the class. Second thing is the getting to know you discussion. That's pretty self-explanatory. I think that's in most classes. Then there's our other regular discussion for week 1, which, just a reminder, if you guys will post by Wednesday and respond to each other's by Sunday. And then we have a paper due this week, and that paper is based on an article that you'll find in session 1 about drug use and alcohol and how that relates to the concept of the biopsychosocial model, which is something we'll be talking a little bit about in this video. If you have any questions about any of those assignments, please let me know. Especially since we won't be seeing each other in person during this class, I really encourage you to reach out with any questions you have. I'm happy to answer anything I can. So the first question I have as we jump into session 1 is, what is psychology? Now, if we were in seat together, I would, up on the whiteboard, have us shout out our answers and our opinions on what we come into this class thinking psychology is. Because obviously it's a big topic and it means different things to different people, and our interpretation of what it means is different from person to person. The definition that we're going to use in this class is one you can find on page 6 in your text. And there it defines psychology as the science of behavior and mental processes. And what I like about that is it keeps us in the mindset that psychology, while it's sort of a softer science in some ways, because it's, it's not chemistry and physics and molecules and equations and things like that, but there is a scientific aspect to it. It is considered a science. The science of behavior. So behavior is just what we do. It's the choices we make, the actions we follow through on, the ways we interact with other people. It's our behavior, the things we do, and the science of our mental processes. And so I like to break that down as sort of our internal experiences, things going on inside our brains and inside our bodies, as well as our interpretation of our external experiences. So the way I perceive or think about or feel about the things going on outside of me. So psychology is kind of a big field, the science of behavior and mental processes. But that's sort of a general description of what all this subject covers. One of the key questions for this week is to sort of understand the history and development of psychology. And I think that's a pretty interesting section in your reading, where you look at how psychology has evolved from when early on, the mostly field of psychology was looking at the structure of the brain, the structure of our mind, and the pieces of how we experience the world. And that developed into the school of functional psychologists or psychology, where people were looking to understand sort of what function does our brain play? What does it fulfill? What function does it have? And then that evolved into more of a focus on behavioralism. So not so much what was going on in our brain itself, but how did we see that externally? What behaviors were we seeing? And that's where I think we really, in those early areas, we see the science side of things, right? That's a very scientific approach. What can I observe and record? And then we started getting more into the world of Freud and analysts, where we began asking questions like, so it's more than just what's on the outside that we need to be studying when we're looking at psychology and understanding people. And it's actually looking into, what are my memories? What are my early childhood experiences? How do those things impact the science of our behavior and mental processes? And then from there, the field of psychology started moving more into the humanist movement, where they said, what kind of potential do we have to impact or grow as humans in our behavior and mental processes. And then sort of the last arena in the development of psychology that's addressed in our book is sort of the cognitive school of thought, where they were saying if we're going to define what psychology is, we really need to look at our cognitions, our ways of thinking about things, because that impacts this science of our behavior and mental processes. And I would say most psychologists and counselors in the mental health field today are kind of a combination of those last three schools, where we say, okay, it's not enough to just look at behavior. That's the sort of training that we use with animals, where we focus on the outcomes and the behaviors. But we're humans. We also have thoughts and feelings and perceptions, and sort of that cognitive school of thought saying our thoughts impact our behavior and vice versa, as well as that humanist field that says, yes, but love, acceptance, a positive environment in which we develop our behaviors and our ways of thinking about things can also play a really big role. So that's sort of a brief flyby of that question about how the field of psychology has evolved. Our discussion this week is about the question of if this field of psychology is it a safe thing? Are there value judgments involved? How do we approach it as Christians who sometimes find our beliefs and values in conflict with the field of psychology? I think that's a really interesting topic, and I'm going to hold off on some of my comments on that because I'll be posting them in the discussion. But I think for me, the big question to ask when we're looking at another one of the key questions for this week, how do value judgments impact the world of psychology? I would say the biggest word to keep in mind in this with this question is perception. Our perceptions play a big part in the value judgments we make, and it's how we filter everything around us in the world. If you guys have been through the worldviews class here at CCU, you'll have some context for that comment. But basically, if you think about you're walking down the street and you see a dog on the street, well, your past experiences, your filter, your perception, your idea of what a dog means, your home life growing up. Did you have a dog in your house? Were you bitten by a neighbor's dog when you were young? Do you like dogs by personality, or are you more of a cat person? All of those factors are going to impact, all those mental cognitive factors are going to impact your behavior and your perception of that dog that you see on the street. So when we talk about, are there value judgments in the field of psychology? I would say there are value judgments in everything we do because we're humans and we're influenced by a lot of factors. And that to me is sort of what psychology looks at. It says, how do we figure out all of these different factors that combine to lead to you being the person you are with the behaviors and mental processes that you have? And how do we scientifically figure out that combination and make sense of it? And I would say as we go through this class, I would encourage us all to kind of have our eyes open to that question of what are my values, my biases, my perceptions, my judgments, and what are those based on? Are they based on and oriented to truth that I know because I believe God is the ultimate source of truth? Are they based on experiences I've had, lies that I might have believed, limited experiences with negative things like, if I had a dog bite me when I was young, that's not necessarily teaching me truth or a value about all dogs, but how are we filtering and perceiving and checking our own biases? And I think also we have to ask the question of how does any science interact with our faith, right? In the fields of biology, archaeology, all of these different areas of science have points at which they interact with our faith or can challenge our faith. And I think it's the same question that we have to bring to the table. So moving on to another one of our key points for this week, the biopsychosocial approach. That's a really key point for this week because not only is it one of the main questions that CCU is expecting us to cover in session 1, but it's also the foundation for how you're going to write your paper this week, where it's asking you to apply the biopsychosocial approach to the world of addiction. So biopsychosocial approach is essentially, it boils down to, it's an explanation for why we do the things we do, why we behave the way we do. It's a way to approach this field of psychology, the science of our behaviors and mental processes. So basically, we can break it down as what it sounds like. The biopsychosocial approach says there's a biological impact on who we are and why we act the way we do. Our genes, our hormones, things like that all influence the way we think and the way we act. The psycho piece, it's our fears, our emotions, our perceptions, our personality, all of those factors psychologically that make us who we are impact the choices that we make and the things that we do. And then the social aspect, our family, our culture, our community, our the media that we're exposed to, all of those social influences impact who we are and why we act the way we do. And I would say, I would ask the question, does that cover all of the influences, all of the factors that impact who we are and why we are the way we are? I think I would add perhaps a spiritual aspect to the biopsychosocial approach, because I personally believe that God and the Holy Spirit interact with us and influence us in a way that's perhaps outside of a biological approach, a psychological approach, a social approach. So that's maybe a question for you guys to chew on a little bit. Is the biopsychosocial approach broad enough? Does it cover every influence? I think it does a pretty good job. So for example, if we were to say, we want to use the biopsychosocial approach to understand someone's fashion choices, for example, why they choose to dress the way they do. Well, let's think about it. Biologically, what are the factors that play into that? Well, maybe someone's body shape, the color of their skin impacts the color of clothes that they like to wear, that sort of thing. Psychological angle, well, how do they feel about themselves? Are they someone who feels insecure and so they cover themselves up with big bulky clothes? Or are they someone who, because they feel insecure, like to show everything off? Well, that's a psychological influence on why someone chooses the fashion that they do. Social. Well, think about if you grew up in a home where your parents taught you modesty is a key value versus if you grew up in a community where all of the successful people around you dressed a certain way, that's probably going to influence the choices that you make about your own fashion sense. And then again, I would say, adding in the spiritual level, there's a lot of values that we can take from our spiritual lives that could play out in things like what style of dress I choose to wear if I come from a faith background that says I need to cover my head or that sort of thing. So that's an example of how we apply the biopsychosocial approach to an arena of study like fashion. And so that's a little example of what you'll be doing when you look at writing your paper this week. How does the biopsychosocial approach tell us something about addictions? And I would also say there's a verse that I think applies to this concept really well. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. That's speaking to this idea that we have many factors in our lives that are part of who we are and are part of how we interact with the world around us and with God. Next topic to talk a little bit about, the scientific method. One of your key questions for this week is what science-based methods does the field of psychology use? Like I said before, it's considered sort of a softer science, and yet many, for the field of psychology to move forward, the research that's being done is really based on scientific means, a scientific method. So I have a little document that I'll be posting that goes through the bullet points of the scientific method. Most of us learn them in middle school. The whole idea of we eliminate bias, we limit our variables, we define our key concepts, we use measurable terms, our work has to be reproducible, it has to be observable. All of those are factors that scientists use when they set up an experiment, and it's the same in the field of psychology. For any theory to be proven, acceptable, and accredited, it needs to meet the qualifications of the scientific method. In your reading this week, spend a little time looking through how psychology can, even though it's sometimes observing things that are difficult to measure, things inside our brains or our experiences or our perceptions, how are those scientific methods applied? It can be a little tricky. And I would say one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at how scientifically things are proven in the field of psychology, it's important to keep an eye on the difference between causation and correlation. Correlation says that sometimes two factors occur around the same time or in the same set of circumstances, but it does not necessarily mean that one causes the other, or that because one exists, the other one will necessarily exist. So, for example, it's common for when there's a baby girl born for there to be a pink nursery or something like that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every baby girl is going to have a pink nursery. That's just a correlation. It means they tend to happen together. Causation is a different thing where you're saying because this happened, it always leads to this. So for example, when we're looking at things in the field of psychology, like I work with a lot of youth who have ended up in the detention system. And I've seen a lot of cases of youth who have been locked up for crimes they've committed, who have trauma and unstable homes, unstable families in their background. Now, that happens a lot at the same time. I see that happening a lot together. That's correlation. But how do we figure out if that's the cause, if that's causation? If because of those factors in their early childhood, they ended up in detention centers. So that's hard to determine. That's hard to separate. So just something to keep in mind when we're looking at how the scientific method applies to the field of psychology. All right, next big topic for this week, the brain. This is a big piece of that biological component in the biopsychosocial approach. Have a lot of resources I'm going to be posting for you guys about the brain. If we were in class, we would probably spend 2 hours talking about the way the brain is structured and how it works, how our neurons in our brains send signals throughout our whole body using neurotransmitters, which are chemicals that our body produces in order to send signals. Again, I've got some video links, some games I'm going to upload that you guys can follow just to learn a little bit more about how that works. But one of the key points I want you guys to take away from this discussion about the brain is neurotransmitters, like I said a minute ago, are those chemicals in our brains. You've probably heard of some of them. The main three ones that I'm going to reference right now, you'll probably have heard them in different contexts: norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. Those are neurotransmitters, chemicals in our brains that send signals throughout our bodies. Norepinephrine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. That means it sends signals to our body to turn on lots of systems like our heartbeat. It makes our heartbeat faster. It makes our breathing faster. It wakes us up. It gets us blood pumping to our extremities. And it's connected directly to alertness and concentration. So when there's an excess of norepinephrine in our brains and in our bodies, we can see things like PTSD. When that neurotransmitter that says we have to be alert, we have to be aware, we have to be focused and concentrating, then you can see things like hypervigilance and startle reactions and those things that you see in people with PTSD. If there's not enough norepinephrine in our systems, then you see things like people being sort of foggy in their thinking or unmotivated. Serotonin. Serotonin is another main neurotransmitter, and that's an inhibitory transmitter, meaning it sort of turns things down in our bodies. It slows us down. It calms us down. It helps with things like sleep, appetite, pain management, digestion, feelings of happiness. And so, interestingly, when we don't have enough serotonin in our systems, that's often when we see things like depression. And so I don't know if you've heard advertisements for antidepressants, things like that. They're often referred to as SSRIs and other medications that have to do with serotonin, because it's been found that that's one of the things that serotonin is responsible for in our system. And then dopamine is another neurotransmitter, again, chemical that sends messages throughout our body. And it actually can play a role as an excitatory and an inhibitory neurotransmitter. But it's really linked to things like our focus, our motivation, and our reward pathways in our brain. Meaning when we do things that are good for our survival or that feel good, serotonin is released to sort of reward us for those things. So, dopamine is released. So for example, when you exercise or you eat yummy food or things like that, your brain releases dopamine to say, hey, good job doing that. It's going to keep us alive. So here's a feeling of reward. Interestingly, dopamine is highly associated with addictions because of that cycle that says when I do this, then I feel better. So what does all of that have to do with our work this week? Well, again, your paper this week is related to the topic of addictions, and all substances like drugs and alcohol mimic the effects of those neurotransmitters in our brains. So when you think about substances like caffeine, nicotine, amphetamines, those are all stimulants like the excitatory neurotransmitters like norepinephrine. And depressants, things like alcohol and opiates, those all act like inhibitory neurotransmitters like serotonin in our brains. So when you think about the patterns of people using substances, they're all mimicking or playing on those natural ways that God has created our brains to work to help us stay balanced and achieving the things that we need to in life. But that's where things can go a little wrong with drugs, because when we're falsely or unnaturally stimulating those things that God intended for good, then they can go bad. I have a link for you guys to a really fun kind of game. It's called Mouse Party, where you take the little computer arm and you put a mouse into a little computer, and it shows you how, in kind of a cartoon way, how these different substances can impact the brain, like those neurotransmitters that we were just talking about. I encourage you to play around with it a little bit before you write your paper this week. There's a lot we could talk about the structure of the brain beyond just the neurons. I personally am a geek about this stuff. I think it's fascinating the way God has designed our brains. We'll talk about it a little bit more next week when we look at lifespan growth and development and how the brain develops over time. So I'm not going to go into it in great detail right now, but I am going to give you a few links to some websites that give you more information about the brain. There's actually a fun little song that some student wrote for another class about the different parts of the brain that I will upload as well. And so I encourage you, when you're thinking about the biopsychosocial model, how does the brain play a role in that? Think when you're thinking about the biological aspect of the biopsychosocial approach, if things aren't working in our brain the way they're supposed to, or even if they are, but they're being overstimulated or created falsely, like through substances, then that's something we need to have in mind when we're trying to understand psychology, the science of why we do and think the way we do. And last topic for this week is sleep. Most of us don't get enough, right? But sleep serves a really important purpose, and I think it's part of God's design for our bodies and our lives. The textbook describes sleep sort of in its evolutionary terms, how it served to protect us when it was dark outside because we were resting and in safe places. But there's a lot more functions that sleep plays that I think are part of God's design for our health and well-being. When we sleep, it gives our bodies time to repair and regenerate from any of the stress and use of the day. It gives us a chance to restore, rebuild, process, and store our memories of the things we experienced that day. If any of you guys saw the movie Inside Out, which I highly recommend, that's one of the jokes in the movie is at nighttime is when the little workers in the brain store all of the memories. That actually is accurate. That's one of the things that happens when we're sleeping. And so when we don't get enough sleep, obviously it's hard to remember the new things that we've learned and experienced that day. But sleep also helps feed creativity, growth. That's why children sleep a lot. And it's when we sort of regenerate our emotional strength and we build resiliency by getting good sleep. So on the flip side, obviously, when we're not sleeping enough, productivity goes down. It's hard to learn new things. It's hard to remember new things. It's hard to master new skills. And not enough sleep can lead to things like depression and a weakened immune system. So sleep is a really important factor. Read up in your reading this week a little bit more about what sleep actually looks like in the different sleep cycles. And again, when we think about sleep disorders, think about the biopsychosocial approach there as well. What are some of the biological factors that might impact our ability to sleep well? What are some of the psychological factors? How many of us sleep poorly when we're worried about something? And then social factors. wanting to be plugged into social media, wanting to be involved in relationships that take time away from sleep, some of the things like that all play into a biopsychosocial understanding of sleep. I also have a couple of fun little quizzes to see if you're getting enough sleep and if you're fatigued from lack of sleep, which I'm sure we'll all probably come up short on, but I've included those for this week too. So I think that is as fast as I could give you a little overview of the topics for session 1. As always, please be in touch with me if you have questions or concerns about any of it. I will be interacting with you in your discussions online this week, and I will be posting those resources that I mentioned. Otherwise, know that I am praying for you all. I know we all have competing factors in our lives that make it hard sometimes to get our work done and be focused on school, but I firmly believe that this class is God's next step for each one of us on the path that He's taking us. And so I do pray that He would be speaking to each one of us and giving us the space and time to really get out of this class what we need. So that's all for this week. Take care and be in touch with any questions or concerns you have.